Well, great to be with you, first of all, and thanks for a discussion of a really important topic because nobody has quite explained in this debate, whether it's the White House or the Congress, how we got to the situation that we're in. Here are the basic numbers. If you look at the debt that the government owes to the public, not that the government owes to other units of the government, it's something around $25 trillion, not quite the 31 trillion, because some of that is owed to the Federal Reserve, for example. Okay, these are technicalities. 25 trillion is still a big number, and it's nearly 100% of our annual output in the country, which is the gross domestic product. Now, back in the year 2000, the debt that was owed by the government was only 35% of the gross domestic product. So it went from being 35% of national income back in the year 2000 to nearly 100% of our national income today. That's a pretty steep increase. That means that we are spending, but not covering that spending by taxes, but covering that spending by borrowing. And obviously, we've been borrowing a lot. The point of my article is that really a lot of that borrowing has gone to fund these useless, wasteful, destructive wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, now Ukraine. That's awful. And when you look at the estimates by the Watson Institute at Brown University, they say that the costs of these wars is about $8 trillion if you combine them, not even up to today, but up to a couple of years ago. Now, there are some definitional issues and some timing issues that mean that we should go a little bit deeper at the technical level. But the point is that if we had kept our debt at 35% of GDP rather than at 100% of GDP, that is about 65% of GDP, or 2/3 of today's GDP of 24 trillion. You do the arithmetic, that's about a $16 trillion, $15 to $16 trillion increase of debt beyond what would have kept the debt at a level relative to income. So what the Watson Institute estimates are showing is that about half of that has gone to war. I think even more than half has really accounted for by the military, because in addition to the war spending, we're funding 800 military bases around the world. We're funding a bloated intelligence world. We're funding all sorts of things that the military-industrial complex likes, that Raytheon or General Dynamics or Boeing or those that are selling weapons like, but are a waste for the American people. Now, mind you, the other half of that increase of debt came from the 2008 financial crisis, which blew a hole in the budget. That was Wall Street excess, let me put it that way. Another part came from the pandemic. Various things could be said about that. But basically, between war, financial crisis, and the pandemic, that's where our budget was blown. And here's the challenge I would put to President Biden. I'm completely against what we're doing in Ukraine because I think this war could have been avoided. I think it has a lot to do with the U.S. relentless push to expand NATO, which, by the way, is a military-industrial complex lobbying goal. That's what they lobby for. They love selling weapons to new NATO members. They want to keep expanding NATO. And other countries, including Russia, say, stop coming up to our border. Okay, so I think this war could have been avoided, but Biden really is part of the military-industrial complex, has been as a senator, a vice president, now as president. He's always backed NATO enlargement. He's backed NATO enlargement to Ukraine. I think it's been reckless. I think it's the reason we have this war. So I'm saying, okay, if you really want to make a deal, stop this wasteful spending, get the military budget under control. But by the way, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are talking about this almost at all.
Yes, it's up to us, right?
They're gonna slash the social safety net, which is already in tatters in this country, and then protect the military spending.
Well,
so that we can have more war.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask you about, Jeffrey Sachs, because I know that at one point during this debt crisis, Republicans were adamant about reducing spending. We even had our House Speaker, I'll put that in quotes, Kevin McCarthy promised the Freedom Caucus and promised the American people that we would not issue a blank check for Ukraine. And now we're up to over $115 billion. Half of that, an estimated half, for weapons and military training. The latest being that the U.S., Biden has agreed that the United States will train Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 fighter jets.
Unbelievable, because it's nonstop escalation. More weapon systems, more destruction, more deaths, more spending. And I remember what I wanted to say, which is I would challenge President Biden, if he wants to continue on this path of the Ukraine war, which I think is tragic and completely solvable if he would stop the NATO enlargement and say to the Russians, go home and we don't go into Ukraine. And that's how you end this war. But I'd like him to say, okay, if we're going to spend more money, we're going to raise taxes to do it. Let's put it to the American people. Fund this, not just put it on the debt. And I'd say to the Republicans also, you want the war? Tell the American people they're going to pay more taxes. You want to have a war in Asia with China? Okay, raise the taxes for that. See how the American people feel about that. They don't dare do it. That's why the debt keeps going up, because these wars are not popular at all. And by the way, they don't want to ask the American people their views about anything. So they just put it onto the debt without asking us, do we really want to have this tragic war in Iraq? Do we really want to have a CIA-led operation to overthrow the Syrian government? Do we really want to bomb Libya back into rubble? They never asked us on any of this stuff. And if they just put it onto the debt, but if they said, okay, this is really important, and we're going to raise taxes to do it, then we could have a good debate in this country. Is this really important, or is this good for General Dynamics? Is this good for Boeing? Is this good for the military-industrial complex? We don't have that debate right now because they hide it on the debt.
That's right. And few people realize that the Department of Defense, Department of War, it used to be called, it should still be called, has never passed an audit. That's because there's missing money and people can't explain where this money has gone. And now we're just hurling money, spending about $6 billion to prop up the government in Ukraine, rather than saying, we'll support a ceasefire, we'll sit down, we'll negotiate with Putin, with Zelensky, maybe have two tracks of diplomacy, but we want to end this war now. No, instead, Biden has committed the United States to train Ukrainian pilots on these F-16 fighter jets, which could take a year or two. I mean, that's in essence saying we're committed to further death, destruction, the risk of nuclear war for another 2 years. But let's get back for a minute to the debt, so-called debt crisis, because you're an economist, Jeffrey Sachs. I want answers to a couple questions in the weeds. Okay. So we have this, you say it's a $24 trillion debt. If you really examine it, the media is saying $31 trillion. Anyway, the point is, where are we getting this money? It's debt. Who do we owe it to? How are we raising this money to pay for all of these wars, including the war in Ukraine?
So the government borrows. It borrows from the public. It borrows from foreign governments that hold this debt. It borrows from foreign wealth holders that owe this debt. And to some extent, the borrowing is okay, but we went from owing 35% of our income to 100% of our gross domestic product. And what the Congressional Budget Office signals is that if we keep on the current policies, the debt will rise to around 160% or even higher of our gross domestic product by mid-century. In other words, we're on an upward spiral because no side, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, want to talk about spending to cover wars and the military budget. Neither one wants to talk about taxing the rich. By the way, that's true not just of the Republicans who fight that, the Democrats fight that. President Biden announces for re-election, and where does he go immediately? To wealthy donors. He goes to Wall Street. This is both parties. Come on. This is why the rich don't pay taxes. So we're on a spiraling rise of debt. You can carry some debt. We all, carry a mortgage maybe if you own a home. Some people have consumer debt and so forth, but you keep it under a limit so that it doesn't get out of hand. And for a while, the interest rates were very, very low. So the government said, oh, look, we can borrow. It doesn't matter. We'll just keep borrowing. But you know what? It turned into inflation. Now the interest rates are going up because the Fed is once again raising interest rates to try to staunch inflation. And suddenly the debt service burden, in other words, how much we have to pay on just interest on this debt, is rising by percentage points of GDP, eating up invaluable tax revenues that we need to help educate our kids, for normal society, for fighting the pandemics and the mental health and the crime and other things that we have a social safety net for. But it's now going to go to debt service. And that is why you keep your debt under control, so that when you collect revenues, you can use it for the important things, not simply to pay interest on what you borrowed in the past.
Now, when we're paying this interest, Jeffrey Sachs, are we paying this interest to Japan, a large holder of U.S. debt, to China, another large holder of U.S. debt? Did they buy treasury bonds? Is that the debt that we're talking about?
Yeah, we pay the interest on anyone that holds U.S. Treasury bills and bonds. That includes a lot of foreign governments, as you've mentioned. It includes a lot of wealthy people in the United States. It includes a lot of pension funds, insurance funds, money market funds backed up by U.S. Treasury bills. Government borrows by selling its bills and bonds in a kind of open market that any wealth holder can buy to include in their wealth or their asset portfolio. So it's wealth holders all over the world of all kinds, from pension funds and insurance funds and money market funds and foreign exchange reserves of other governments. The point from our governmental point of view is that's okay if it's 35% of GDP, even if it's 50% of GDP. By the way, it's okay if it went up to 100% of GDP and we had used the difference for making wonderful investments that were going to boost the economy. But where did that increase of debt come from? That 16 trillion that I talked about, what was it used for? Was it used for modernizing our infrastructure and making everything work well in the US? No, it went to wars, down the drain. It went to the veterans spending for all the wounded soldiers that suffered from this, a huge bill, human disaster, financial and fiscal disaster. It went also for this Wall Street debacle in 2008 when they were playing games with subprime mortgages, and we ended up with a massive recession. And it went to the spending on the COVID pandemic. And so we don't have the infrastructure or the investment, the physical capital, as the counterpart of all that borrowing. We have a lot of waste. It's very sad. We ran up the debt and we have nothing to show for it except, my God, why did we do that? Well, I think if we're just speaking technically about it, we are at the end of the American-led world by fact, not even by these disastrous blunders, but simply by the fact that other countries, and of course, most notably China, but not China alone, has very talented, well-educated, skilled people with a strong infrastructure and strong technology. So a country, the US, with 4.1% of the world population, should never presume to run the world or to write the rules. We are intrinsically in a multipolar world. But the whole idea of neoconservatism in the United States, and that's the government we have right now, and it's bipartisan, it's Democrats and Republicans, is that the US is the unique unipolar country, and it must resist any potential competitors, most importantly China, and Russia is viewed as a more minor regional threat. It's mind-boggling, but that is the literal view of Victoria Nuland. It is the view of her husband, Robert Kagan, who writes these books that are shocking in their naivete, like The Jungle Grows Back, the whole theme of which is the world's a jungle, the US is a garden, and it's the job of the United States to stop the jungle. It's gross. That's actually, I'm telling you, that is the guiding principles. And Canada, please think clearly. Come on. You guys are better than that. Really. So please act better than that. Don't just follow the US line into these wars of trying to defend hegemonic power. The next one will be over Taiwan. That could end all of it. Even this one can end all of it. Today we took what seems to be another horrible step of escalation. If it's true, who knows whether it's true or not true, but I was just watching the video that the Russian government has posted of Ukrainian drones intercepted over the Kremlin. If this is right, are we kidding? And I wrote to leading journalists because they said, the Financial Times wrote this afternoon, I can't even make sense of it. It said, hold on, let me see if I can find it, because it's so indicative of the crazy mindset. Oh my God. Yeah, well, they changed it from when I read it this morning. Now it says, if confirmed, the apparent attempt on Putin's life and the acknowledgement from the Kremlin would mark an extraordinary admission of Russian vulnerability. Instead of saying, oh my God, are we really going to have World War III? It was taken all day by the Financial Times all afternoon as, well, look at this. What is, this is Russian vulnerability. There are no grown-ups right now in our governments or in the media that parrot our governments. Honestly, I'm 68. I've been through the Vietnam War, through the Gulf Wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Serbia, Syria, countless CIA overthrows of governments. I've never seen anything like we're seeing right now. And it may be because of this desperation of the US of somehow seeing its hegemonic rule questioned, or it may be that they've lost their minds out of decades of arrogance. I don't know what it is.
Thank you. Thank you for that commentary. We're going to move on to the next journalist, Alex Koch from the Maple. Alex, are you there?
Hello?
Hello? Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. This is a question for Professor Sachs. To your point, or to your plea for Canada to see reason and to push for negotiations and diplomacy, my question is like, do you think that even if Canada wanted to do that, that it would make an impression on the United States and NATO more generally? Does Canada have the clout to actually make a difference on this issue?
Canada, together with other countries, certainly could help the United States to see reality. So if Canada and France, who I know looks askance at this but dares not say so many times, though once in a while Macron lets something out, Germany, India, Brazil, China, everybody knows that this is a disaster, but nobody tells the US. And actually a European prime minister said to me a year ago, I said, why don't you say something? And he said, because they treat us like children. A prime minister of a major European country said that to me. It still makes my skin crawl. I don't know why they allow themselves to be treated like children. The United States is not all powerful. It can't put one foot ahead of the next one these days. So there's actually no reason but to say, this isn't working so well. We actually need to think through this before the world gets blown up. And there is no strategy on this because Ukraine could lose on the battlefield, and if it wins, it gets destroyed. And all we're told, the only thing we're told, Biden had 1 minute of honesty a year ago. He said, we're on a path to Armageddon. All the newspapers immediately rose up in unison and said, don't talk like that. Don't ever say that again. We're not allowed to say that. It's unbelievable. So yes, Canada can make a difference, but not by itself. But the fact of the matter is a lot of leaders know this, but one by one, they're scared.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Alex, did you have a follow-up or?
Yeah, kind of related to that. Obviously this conflict has resulted in new members of NATO being added. So in the short term, it looks like, NATO is stronger in a sense as a result of this war. But in the long term, do you think this war will actually weaken NATO's standing in the international community, or will it continue to grow, in your opinion?
Well, the most important thing is to define the international community. The international community is the US, Canada, Britain, the European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. Those are the countries that are aligned with the US. The rest of the world is nowhere near this. The attitude of the rest of the world is, holy shit, what are you guys doing? And you're killing us in the interim because we actually have a lot of hungry people. We have a lot of problems. You've disrupted the whole world economy. And so remember that it's 20% of the world is the international community, according to the United States. And then they can't understand, oh, how could Lula say this? How could Lula go to China? How could the Saudis say this? They don't understand anything about the world that I live in, which is the other 80% of the world. Watching this, the other 80% of the world ain't impressed, believe me. And they're not standing up and rooting for the United States. And what we consider the world, or sometimes called the West, which is a term I hate for basically because it's such a bad term to describe this, but it is essentially the North Atlantic countries that have been the dominant countries for the last 2 centuries, plus the honorary members, Japan and Korea, and the Anglo-Saxon offshoots, so-called, of Australia and New Zealand. That's it. And they don't understand that the rest of the world actually has other concerns and doesn't want to back a NATO expansion war and doesn't want to live under the threat of nuclear annihilation because of the unwillingness of Ottawa and Washington to negotiate over NATO enlargement.
Thank you. So we're at the top of the hour now. I'm going to try and squeeze in. We have one last journalist, Aidan from the Canada Files. Are you there? We'll have to be a little bit brief as we've come pretty much to the end of our time. But Aidan, please do ask your question.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Aidan Jonah, Editor-in-Chief of Canada Files. So I have a question for Mr. Sachs. So the Canada Files recently, we interviewed Dimitri Lascaris, who is on a fact-finding trip to Russia, and also Canadian Tamara Lawrence also went on a fact-finding trip to Russia a few months before that. What are your thoughts on the value of fact-finding trips to Russia and understanding their perspective with this conflict?
As a general matter, I'm in favor of all possible discussion and outreach of various kinds, whether it's academics or cultural or sports. I don't want to see Russia boycotted in the Olympics. I find all of this idea of dividing the world to be extraordinarily dangerous, and the idea that we don't talk to our counterparts to be extraordinarily dangerous. For me, fact-finding is fine and good. In fact, not just fine, but Biden picking up the phone and speaking with President Putin wouldn't be bad. Even if they didn't agree, talk. Have a Zoom together. Hear each other's points of view. But that would require the maturity of maybe a 17-year-old. I don't know. But these are kids. These are children, the way they behave. And it's all bullying, shouting, taunting, humiliating, not talking. So this is incredible. When did Prime Minister Trudeau last speak to President Putin? And why not? Canada's got big stakes in this. Is it just we repeat whatever propaganda we want, or do we talk to each other? Hear the ideas. That is my biggest recommendation of all. Talk. Negotiate trade arrangements in Asia that exclude China. What a clever idea. Let's have trade in Asia, but not China, which is the main trade partner of all the Asian countries. Only America could invent such an idea. It's close your eyes, wish 3 times, and sprinkle fairy dust, and good things will happen to you. It's bizarre, but these things are actually spelled out in print and then followed. Ban exports of technology. This was on the list in 2015. Sanctions, using the financial system, setting the rules for various technologies and trade, all spelled out precisely. So this is the question that consumes our international relations specialists. It consumes the think tanks in Washington. It consumes the American leadership, how to stay number one, which is, to me, a very uninteresting question, except that it is so dangerous to have that mindset. And that is, unfortunately, where we are.
Mr. Bayard, what was your question, quick, again?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So just to give you a quick personal insight into that, which I did not understand at the time.
Okay. So my question
Yes,
was.
I got it.
You
I got it. Yes.
Okay.
So I was just going to give you an example. In 1989, I was asked to be economic advisor to Poland's Solidarity Movement and then to its first post-communist government of Prime Minister Mazowiecki. And I mentioned earlier, I drafted a plan for them. And I created a framework for financial stabilization. And I wrote various key steps of that because that was my specialty at the time. And how to stabilize the currency, how to stabilize the financial system, how to stabilize the money, and so forth. The US accepted everything I recommended. In fact, just to show you how it works, one day in September 1989, I had an idea for $1 billion stabilization fund to back the Polish currency. And I literally typed out the idea on one page at 8 in the morning. I went to see Senator Robert Dole, who was the Senate Majority Leader, at 9 in the morning. He told me to return at 10 in the morning. And there was General Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor. He said, Jeffrey, explain it to General Scowcroft. And I did. General Scowcroft asked me, is this the best approach? And I said, I think it is, General. And he said, please call Senator Dole at the end of the day. At 5 p.m., I called Senator Dole and he said, Jeffrey, tell your Polish friends they have their $1 billion. So it was from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Literally. Okay. Now, I made a number of recommendations, and I thought, pretty cool. They're all being accepted. And they worked, which is why President Gorbachev asked me for help. And I suggested similar strategies multiplied by 5, because that was the difference of the size, actually, at the time, multiplied by 10. Because it was the Soviet Union in 1991. And Gorbachev was invited to the G7, and I and a team at MIT and Harvard presented what was called the Grand Bargain to support Gorbachev. This was even before Russian independence. The White House turned it down flat. Didn't even want a follow-up note or memo, just said, we're not giving anything to the Soviet Union. Okay. Then Gorbachev came back from the G7 and was kidnapped, and in that putsch attempt, and Yeltsin emerged as the dominant political figure. And by September, Yeltsin had reached out to me, please come to Moscow to help us. So I came to Moscow and I explained, they said, how did Poland stabilize its currency? How did Poland get its debt canceled and so forth? And I explained the dynamics. Well, can this work for Russia? Because we're going to have an independent Russia. And I said, it's important because you face financial collapse. And so this is very important. By the way, all my thinking was guided by John Maynard Keynes' Economic Consequences of the Peace, 1919. Don't end a war in disaster for the vanquished. You end up with what everybody knows. You end up with the risk of complete disaster a generation later. So this was very much on my mind. And I proposed a similar strategy for Russia. It was turned down completely. I said, but it already proved itself. The Secretary of State said to my face in early 1992, Mr. Sachs, suppose I even agreed with you on what you're saying. Suppose the Polish finance minister had said the same thing to me that you're saying. I want to give you a piece of advice, Mr. Sachs. It's not going to happen. Okay. Very clear. Being very stubborn on my side, I didn't believe him, because usually anything I've wanted, I've had to argue for. But it didn't happen. It never happened. It didn't happen with Bush. It didn't happen with Clinton. The idea of the United States helping Russia to recover never crossed their mind for a moment. This is the most basic point. Russia's on the outside. We move the Iron Curtain several hundred kilometers to the east, but we still face this problem on the other side. That's the mindset. The motivation is being number one. The motivation is being number one. By the way, the motivation was we don't have to listen to anybody. We are the unipolar power. We are the most powerful country in the history of the world. And there's a famous, justly famous episode of Wesley Clark, who was the NATO commanding general under Clinton, going to the Pentagon in the early 1990s and being told specifically in 1992, I believe it is, that we're going to clean up now, clean up all those Soviet-backed governments, Iraq, Syria, Libya, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have a series of wars, he was told. And then after 2001, he was told the same thing. Now we can clean up everything. So this is an idea. It's a concept. It's a concept of state power, not a healthy one. And it's been deeply seated, and we're still at it. And these events are playing out in real time right now. They're extremely dangerous, and they're bringing us back to the brink of nuclear war. Because Russia does not want a US-led unipolar world. China does not want a US-led unipolar world. Indeed, outside of the EU, United States, UK, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, nobody else wants a unipolar US world. So we have the West, so-called, with about maybe 15% of the world population, and the rest of the world saying, what are you doing? Could you make peace and calm down rather than breaking everything? Now, let me end by saying I'm not exonerating Russia's responsibilities. I'm saying that we could have avoided this conflict and we could end this conflict now. But we cannot end it on US terms of NATO enlargement. There is no path to that possible. So until we understand that, we will have the risk of escalation and we will have war. The only way to end this is on a path that respects Russia's perceived security interest in not having NATO in Ukraine. And when we accept that, a lot will be possible.
Yeah, I learned a lot in the process of being chairman of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. So when I was asked, I have a fair amount of experience in public health. I helped to organize originally the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and had chaired a commission for WHO and had worked on epidemic diseases. So I was very familiar with the community, and I was friends with Fauci, by the way, going back to 2001. I wrote him a memo why we needed a plan that eventually became PEPFAR, even with the number that I gave right at the beginning that we need a $3 billion a year plan. And I went to brief him and Condi Rice and so forth in the first weeks of the Bush administration. So, okay, I was very honored to take on the assignment of chair of the commission. And I listened around and I thought, well, the scientists have said in an article in Nature Medicine in March 2020 that this was natural. Basically, they said irrefutably so, essentially. And I thought that was plausible because that's what pandemics are. They are zoonoses. That means they go from animals to humans, and that's what SARS was, and on and on. So I actually I hired the guy. It's absolutely fascinating. I didn't hire him. There was no money involved, but I asked Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, which is in the center of the in
the villain of the COVID pandemic for a lot of people. Yeah.
I said, Peter, why don't you be chair of our task force, not of the commission, but of the task force working on the origin of this virus? Because you know a lot about it. You know what's going on in China. You know about bat viruses and so forth. Okay, that's stepping into it. So I did. I stepped into it, and we started. And I started to get a bit of hate mail towards the end of 2020, which is not so unusual. But, you know, Sachs, why did you put this guy in? And a Republican congressman, this is disgraceful. And I wrote back saying, look, I'm completely open-minded. I've given the assignment to them, find out the truth of what this is. And if it's from a lab, we're going to, and if it's possible, we're going to track that down. And believe me, he doesn't make the judgment. There are 28 commissioners. I'm in charge of this and so forth. Okay. So you start seeing, because of the relentless work of this organization you started, The Intercept and U.S. Right to Know, we start getting strange things coming out, which is, but it took a long time just to get those first FOIAs coming out. And things start dropping that are a little weird. And then I got a wonderful briefing by a top scientist who explained to me, Jeff, it's, it's not what is being said. Let me explain to you the research that was going on. And I was like, oh my God. He explained gain of function research to me for the first time in 2 or 3 hours of pretty detailed technical work. And he said, go read the NIH proposals. So I went online afterwards and I read that aim 1 is to test these chimeric viruses in the following way. And oh shit, I got to figure out what's going on. So I went to Daszak the next day and I said, Peter, I need to see your full research proposal. And his line to me was, no, my lawyers say I can't share that with you. I said, are you kidding? We're in a commission that is a transparent public commission. No, my lawyers say I can't share that with you.
The most significant pandemic in almost a century.
So I said you're off the task force. Forget it. We're not going to have that. But all of that's a long way to say things started to be peeled back in a most remarkable way. I give huge credit to The Intercept and to U.S. Right to Know, and to a whistleblower who posted the decisive document, which is the DARPA Diffuse research proposal that was posted by a whistleblower that is almost a cookbook, how to make a SARS-CoV-2 virus. Well, this became rather a fascinating thing, because the more we knew, the more we could see that what those scientists had written was phony. That's first of all. Second, that Fauci had been lying. That was absolutely clear. And third, I have to correct you, Glenn, it wasn't 3 weeks, it was 3 days after the February 1 conference call where they said, I can't figure out how this could have come out of nature.
Right.
3 days later, that they have the first draft of a paper that's called Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2, which is the one that says it's definitely natural. And you know what?
And then anyone who thinks otherwise is a malicious disinformation agent and conspiracy theorist.
Right. And by the way, so the bottom line, this is a long story. It's absolutely fascinating. But the bottom line is the following. First, there's a weird part of this virus called a furin cleavage site. It's 4 amino acids, which make the virus highly infectious and deadly. Second, that was a target of known research. Third, it was the target of the DARPA Diffuse project. Fourth, it was a major target of University of North Carolina in partnership with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It's obvious there's something to explain here. Maybe it's a weird coincidence. Maybe, and I think more than likely, it's part of the research gone awry. But not only did Fauci hide this, and also the public, as usual, didn't learn that already in the spring of 2020, the Department of Energy, because it's Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and Department of Energy was one, and another.
The FBI
had already found that there was a good chance that this was coming out of a lab, and
Right.
no one was telling us anything. I'm getting a bad echo right now, Glenn.
Oh, we're gonna try and fix that right now. Yeah, so they're gonna work that, but I just want to say, go ahead.
But, Glenn, if I could
go ahead. You finish your answer. You finish first.
Just to give you the bottom line, to this day, no Democrat in Congress will touch this. It's the weirdest thing. The Republicans say we need to investigate. I was just with Senator Rand Paul. He's done a great job of saying we need to find out what this is. He can't get Democrats on this because protecting Fauci or protecting Biden, I don't know what they think they're doing. How the heck did the origin of SARS-CoV-2 become a partisan issue? That is so weird, so strange, so unpleasant. And yet that's how our politics has basically disintegrated.
It's bizarre. Even totally what should be totally apolitical questions, like a scientific question about the origin of the most significant pandemic in 100 years, whether we played a role with good intentions or otherwise in causing
a small number of primary commodities and so forth, but to be leading technology innovators and shapers of the world. So I'm less worried about such economies than I am about countries that are absolutely trapped in extreme poverty or they have one commodity to sell. There's a recent study that shows that in large parts of the world, young children don't even learn the most basic skills of reading, mathematics, and science. So what's going to happen to them? That's a kind of dependency because they will not be living in places with ability to provide decent jobs and livelihoods and so forth. So this question of dependency is real. It has a geopolitical element to it. Imperialism was a way to create and enforce and sustain and perpetuate dependency because imperial powers, the Europeans in Africa, for example, did not educate the populations of those countries. Today, when a country is independent, its first task should be a good education of its children. This is the most important thing that any government can do. And interestingly, going back to Aristotle, he believed in public education. Going back to Adam Smith, who was the free market economist, he believed in public education and so on. And I would say that that's the key way not to be a dependent economy.
I'd be curious to see what Professor Sachs's understanding is on culture and education's role in shaping development and crisis resolution plans, especially going forward into an unprecedented recession, along with looming epidemics and a climate crisis. My question, therefore, is mostly about how Professor Sachs would approach the potential threat of overlooking these factors, culture, people, and their levels of education, etc., in the present, while focusing on the economic aspects of the conflicts today.
to repeat what I was just suggesting, when I'm asked about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I always start by saying that SDG 4, quality of education for all children, is the most important of all the Sustainable Development Goals. Education is the key at an individual level, and it's the key at a societal level for being able to create the kind of future that we want. In SDG 4 is a target, SDG Target 4.7, which says that all children should learn global citizenship, appreciation for culture, appreciation for cultural diversity. In other words, to understand we're in a diverse world, to understand a culture of peace in that diverse world. So our cultural heritage is fundamental for us as human beings and our identities, but our cultural appreciation of others is fundamental for our ability to live in an interconnected, diverse world. So education and respect and knowledge of our own cultures, but respect and knowledge of other cultures as well, and especially the respect for diversity, so that we learn to treat each other with respect and in a peaceful way.
Is international development a project of the idea that the West is good and everything else is bad? Is development capitalocentric and orientalist in nature? If so, what is a way out?
Modern economic development really began with the invention of the steam engine and the breakthrough to industrialization. And that changed economic life, created urban industrial societies. It created vast disparities of power, of economic well-being. It created the openings for European imperialism and many other of the basic structures of the modern world. When it started around 1750, it really began in England and in Western Europe for a lot of historical reasons and accidents that I describe in a recent book, The Ages of Globalization. There was no intrinsic reason why the industrial age began in Europe, but it resulted from a deeper history that one can study and understand. Suffice it to say, that put the West in the driver's seat, in the military control for 200 years. We're at the end of that phase right now. This is one of the great transformations that's taking place in our world. The Western dominance is going away because China has recovered from 150 years of great economic difficulty that one can even date to the British wars, the Opium Wars that started in 1839 against China. But Asia is in an ascendancy since the early 1950s, since the restoration of sovereignty to China, to India, and so forth. And this is changing geopolitics, and it's changing the meaning of development itself. It can't be a Western project anymore. The West doesn't have the dominance militarily, technologically, demographically, certainly economically, that it had before. It's interesting that if you measure economies at the so-called purchasing power basis or international price basis, the BRICS countries, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, those 5 countries now have a larger combined gross output than the G7 countries, which is the United States, UK, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. And I think I said Canada in there, but the 7 countries which thought they ran the world 40 or 50 years ago. But now the BRICS countries are actually larger economically. And this means that development, and we always should say sustainable development now, because development has to be economic betterment in a context of environmental sustainability. And that's the essence of sustainable development, that economic development should be socially just and environmentally sustainable. That's not a Western project. That is a global effort, and we need to cooperate together to achieve it. That's why the whole world adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. It's why the whole world adopted the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. And I have said that the G7, which is that representation of Western power, should actually end, because we should go to the G20, which is now developed and developing countries together, not the West, but the world. And I've advocated that the G20 first should be the African Union. And so we bring Africa to the front table and really get on with a worldwide coordinated and cooperative effort to achieve sustainable development.
How do you deal with the so-called triple threat? Climate change as an existential crisis, capitalism as a material economic crisis, if you believe that, and modernity as a cultural crisis.
I believe that we start with the idea of building the future we want. And I believe that we can identify the kinds of lives that people around the world want. They want to be able to have economic security. They want to have decent nutrition, shelter, education for their children, healthcare, peace, social protection. Indeed, these are known as economic rights already identified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago next year, actually, since the Universal Declaration was adopted in 1948. That's the future we want. Then we ask, how do we build that? And that's a step-by-step construction project. And it in a way, it is a brick at a time. You need a blueprint. You need a strategy for creating this shared world, because it is a shared and interdependent world. But it's not beyond our means to see our way forward. And when it comes to issues of climate, we know we have to change technologies. We have to decarbonize the energy system, for example. When it comes to economic systems, we know it can't be the raw free market. That's not free for most of the world. That's incredibly costly for most of the world. But it can be a mixed economic system of market, government, and civil society in a balanced way. When it comes to modernity, it means that we cherish and build on our cultural traditions, our religious traditions, our very distinct and diverse traditions, but we appreciate our global reality and our interdependence as well. And to my mind, this opens up the possibility of a future that really is one of well-being, of social justice, of sustainability, and of peace. And that is the vision of sustainable development.
Is there anything you'd like to say to students today that are just entering university that you would sort of alert them to? What's the importance of an education?
Let me say to students the words that President John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural address on January 20th, 1961. He said, "For the world is very different now. Mankind holds in his mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." What President Kennedy was saying is, it's our existential reality that with the tools that we have, we can solve fundamental problems. We can end poverty. But at the same time, with the tools that we have, we could destroy the whole world through nuclear war or environmental ruin. You as young people, this is your world. You're going to be building it. You are going to be leaders. Choose the right path. Understand that that is the fundamental moral and ethical way forward, that there are choices. There's no use in predicting the future. Build the future. Seize the future that the world wants. Do it with justice. Do it with knowledge. Do it with respect. and especially respect for others in other societies. And then we can be in a world without extreme poverty. We can be in a world in which prosperity is shared. We can be in a world of justice. We can be in a world in which the horrible dangers of climate change have been sharply reduced by the energy transformation and land transformations that we need. And especially we can be in a world of peace. This is your world. Go build the world, the future that we want.